Elvis lowered his microphone in the middle of "Love Me Tender." His voice faded into silence. The band hesitated, glancing at each other in confusion, their instruments faltering one by one. The arena fell silent so quickly that people in the back rows could hear their own heartbeat pounding in their chests. Elvis stood frozen at the edge of the stage, staring into the crowd with an expression no one had seen before. Something had caught his attention. Someone had broken through the wall of screaming fans and flashing lights, and what happened in the next 20 minutes would become one of the most powerful moments in rock and roll history. It was March 8, 1973, at the Houston Astrodome in Texas. The place was packed wall to wall with 19,000 fans who had waited months for this night. Some had driven hundreds of miles. Others had saved for weeks just to afford a ticket. The energy in the building was electric, almost tangible, like static before a lightning strike. Elvis was in the middle of one of his most explosive tours, performing 2 shows back to back, and tonight's crowd was hungry for every second of his performance. The first show had been pure fire. Elvis had torn through jailhouse rock, his hips swiveling with that signature move that had made him famous. He'd belted out Suspicious Minds with so much passion that people in the front rows swore they could feel the heat radiating off him. Then came Burning Love, and the entire Astrodome had turned into a sea of waving arms and screaming voices. Teenage girls cried. Grown men stood on their chairs. Security guards had their hands full trying to keep people from rushing the stage. But now, an hour into the show, Elvis had transitioned into the softer, more intimate part of his set. This was the part of every Elvis concert where the chaos melted away and something deeper took over. The lights dimmed from bright white to soft amber. The screaming softened to a reverent hum. People sat down, holding hands, swaying gently. Elvis walked over to the grand piano at center stage, his sequined white jumpsuit catching the stage lights like 1,000 tiny stars scattered across his body. Sweat glistened on his forehead. His chest rose and fell with deep, measured breaths. He sat down at the piano bench, adjusted the microphone, and placed his hands on the keys. The opening chords of "Love Me Tender" filled the arena, gentle and warm, like a lullaby. Elvis's voice, usually powerful and commanding, softened into something tender and vulnerable. This was the Elvis that his mother had known. The Elvis who sang gospel songs in church as a boy. The Elvis who understood that music wasn't just about performance, it was about connection. He sang the first verse with his eyes half closed, lost in the music, his fingers moving delicately across the keys. The crowd swayed. Mothers held their daughters close. Couples leaned into each other. For a few precious minutes, the world outside the Astrodome didn't exist. There was only Elvis, the piano, and the song. But then, halfway through the second verse, something happened. From somewhere near the front, a voice cut through the music. It wasn't a scream of excitement or a shout of adoration. It was different. It was sharp, desperate, raw. It was a cry for help. "Elvis, please! My daughter!" Elvis stopped singing mid-word. His hands froze on the piano keys, hovering in the air like he'd been struck by lightning. The band kept playing for a few seconds, oblivious, but then they noticed Elvis had stopped. One by one, the instruments went silent. The drummer's cymbals faded. The bassist let his note die out. The backup singers exchanged confused glances. The entire Astrodome held its breath. Elvis stood up slowly from the piano bench, his movements careful and deliberate. He walked to the very edge of the stage, his boots stopping just inches from the drop-off. He squinted into the harsh stage lights, trying to see past the glare, trying to locate where the voice had come from. "Ma'am?" Elvis said into the microphone, his southern accent thick with concern. "Who's calling out?" The arena was dead silent now. You could hear the hum of the electrical equipment, the faint buzz of the overhead lights. 19,000 people turned their heads, craning their necks, trying to find the source of the voice. Then, from the fourth row, center section, a woman stood up. Her movements were shaky, unsteady. She was holding something in her arms, something small, something wrapped in a pink blanket. It was a little girl, no more than 5 years old, her tiny body cradled against her mother's chest. The child's face was pale, almost translucent under the arena lights, with dark circles under her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and endless pain. Her head rested limply against her mother's shoulder, too weak to hold itself up. "My daughter," the woman shouted again, her voice cracking with emotion, breaking on every syllable. "She's been in the hospital for 6 months. The doctors said she might not make it through the week. All she wanted, all she's talked about, was seeing you. Please, Elvis. Please." The crowd gasped collectively, a sharp intake of breath that echoed through the massive space. A wave of murmurs rippled through the arena, starting at the front and spreading backward like falling dominoes. Some people started crying before anything had even happened. The raw, unfiltered pain in that mother's voice was something no one could ignore. It cut through the spectacle, through the glitter and lights, and reminded everyone in that building that real life, real suffering, existed just beyond the stage. Elvis stood there for a long moment, his chest rising and falling, his jaw tight. He looked at the little girl in the woman's arms, and something inside him shifted. The king of rock and roll, the man who commanded stages and crowds with effortless charisma, suddenly looked like just a man. A man who understood suffering. A man who had seen too much loss in his own life. His twin brother, Jesse Garin, had been stillborn. His mother, Gladys, had died when Elvis was only 23, and the grief had nearly destroyed him. He knew what it meant to lose someone. He knew what it meant to feel helpless. "What's your daughter's name?" Elvis asked softly, his voice now stripped of its usual showmanship. It was just Elvis, just a human being asking another human being a question. "Sarah," the woman answered, her voice barely audible even in the silence. "Her name is Sarah." Elvis nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving the little girl. Then he did something no one expected. "Boys," he said to his band, without taking his eyes off the woman, "we're taking a break." The band members looked at each other in shock. Take a break? In the middle of a sold-out show? Colonel Parker, Elvis's notoriously controlling manager, was probably backstage having a heart attack. But Elvis wasn't asking for permission. He was already walking off stage. But what happened next stunned everyone. Elvis disappeared into the wings, and for a moment, the crowd didn't know what to do. The house lights came up slightly, casting the arena in a strange twilight. Some people sat down, confused. Others whispered nervously to the people next to them. Security guards started moving toward the fourth row, thinking there might be a problem, that maybe this woman needed to be escorted out. But then, less than 2 minutes later, Elvis reappeared. Not on stage. In the audience. He was walking down the center aisle, flanked by 2 bodyguards who looked just as surprised as everyone else. He was heading straight toward the woman and her daughter. The crowd erupted, not with screams of excitement, but with gasps of disbelief. People stood up, craning their necks to see. Cameras flashed like lightning bugs in the darkness. But Elvis didn't stop to acknowledge any of them. He didn't wave. He didn't smile. He didn't sign autographs. He walked with purpose, his eyes locked on Sarah and her mother. When he reached them, he knelt down in the aisle, right there among the crowd, so he was at eye level with the little girl. The mother was crying so hard she could barely breathe. Her whole body shook with sobs. Sarah, despite her illness, despite the exhaustion that weighed down her tiny frame, opened her eyes slightly and looked at Elvis. Recognition flickered across her pale face. Her lips parted in a small, fragile smile. "Hi, sweetheart," Elvis said gently, his voice soft enough that only the people in the immediate rows could hear him. "Your mama tells me you've been fighting real hard." Sarah nodded weakly, her small hand emerging from the blanket and reaching out toward him. Her fingers were thin, almost skeletal, and they trembled as they moved through the air. Elvis took her tiny hand in his and held it carefully, as if it were made of glass, as if one wrong move might shatter it completely. "You're the bravest girl I've ever met," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "And I want you to know something. You're stronger than any song I've ever sung. You're stronger than anything I've ever done on that stage. You hear me?" Tears were streaming down the mother's face now, falling onto Sarah's blanket. People in the surrounding rows were openly sobbing. Grown men wiped their eyes. Teenage girls clutched their friends. Even the bodyguards, hardened professionals who'd seen everything, looked like they were struggling to hold it together. Then Elvis did something that became legendary. He reached up to his neck and removed the silk scarf he'd been wearing during the performance. It was one of his signature scarves, custom-made, soaked with sweat from the show, a piece of Elvis that fans would have paid thousands of dollars to own. He gently draped it around Sarah's neck, tucking it carefully into her blanket. "This is for you, Sarah," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "And every time you wear it, I want you to remember that you've got the heart of a lion. You keep fighting, okay? You keep fighting for me." Sarah smiled. It was a small, fragile smile, barely visible, but it was real. And in that moment, she looked less like a dying child and more like just a little girl meeting her hero. But Elvis wasn't finished. He turned to Sarah's mother, who was now trembling so hard she could barely stand. "Ma'am," he said, his voice steady and calm, "what hospital is she in?" "Texas Children's Hospital," the woman managed to say through her tears. Elvis nodded, his expression serious. "I'm going to make a call tonight. I'm going to make sure Sarah gets whatever she needs. The best doctors, the best care, the best treatment available. Everything. You hear me? Everything." The mother couldn't speak. She just held her daughter tighter and sobbed, her whole body shaking with a mixture of grief and gratitude and disbelief. Elvis stood up slowly, his knees cracking slightly from kneeling. He leaned down and kissed the top of Sarah's head, his lips brushing against her fine, thin hair. Then he turned back toward the stage. As he walked up the aisle, the entire arena rose to its feet. But this time, they didn't cheer. They didn't scream. They didn't whistle or shout. The applause was slow, respectful, almost reverent, like the applause you hear at a funeral or a graduation. It was the sound of 19,000 people honoring something sacred, something bigger than music, bigger than fame. When Elvis returned to the stage, he didn't say a word to the crowd. He didn't explain what had happened. He didn't need to. Everyone had seen it. Everyone understood. He sat back down at the piano, took a deep breath that seemed to come from the very bottom of his soul, and started playing Love Me Tender from the beginning. But this time, it sounded different. It sounded heavier, more personal, like he was singing it directly to Sarah, like every word was a promise. And that's when everything changed. The crowd joined in, all 19,000 people. Softly at first, barely audible, then louder, their voices blending together into something massive and beautiful. They sang with him, turning the song into something bigger than a concert performance. It became a prayer, a message of hope, a collective act of love for a little girl who was fighting for her life. When the song ended, there wasn't a dry eye in the Houston Astrodome. Elvis stood up from the piano, walked to the front of the stage, and just stood there for a moment, looking out at the crowd. He didn't say anything. He just nodded once, as if to say, "Thank you." Then he launched into the next song, and the concert continued. But everyone knew that the real show had already happened. The moment he walked into that crowd, the moment he knelt down beside Sarah, the moment he chose compassion over performance. After the concert, true to his word, Elvis made the call. He contacted Texas Children's Hospital personally and arranged for Sarah to receive treatment from one of the top pediatric oncologists in the country. He covered every expense, every test, every procedure, every medication. He sent gifts to her hospital room, stuffed animals, flowers, records, and every week, without fail, he called to check on her progress, speaking to her mother, asking about Sarah's condition, offering words of encouragement. But then something unexpected happened. Sarah didn't die that week. She didn't die that month. Against all odds, against every medical prediction, she started to improve. The treatments that Elvis had arranged began to work. Her color returned. Her strength came back. She started eating again, laughing again, playing again. The doctors were baffled. They called it a statistical anomaly, a medical miracle, one of those rare cases that defied explanation. Sarah's mother called it the power of love. She believed that the moment Elvis knelt down beside her daughter, something shifted. Some invisible force had entered Sarah's body and given her the strength to keep fighting. And 6 months later, Sarah walked out of Texas Children's Hospital holding her mother's hand, wearing Elvis's scarf around her neck like a cape. But there was one more twist coming. In August of 1977, just 4 years after that night in Houston, the world woke up to devastating news. Elvis Presley had died at Graceland, his mansion in Memphis. He was only 42 years old. The world mourned. Millions of fans gathered outside Graceland, lining the streets, holding candles, weeping openly. Radio stations played his music on endless loops. Newspapers ran front-page obituaries with photos of Elvis in his prime. And among the thousands of people who came to pay their respects, standing in line outside Graceland in the sweltering Memphis heat, was a 9-year-old girl wearing a faded silk scarf around her neck. Sarah had come to say goodbye. When the press asked her why she was there, she didn't hesitate. Her answer was simple, direct, and heartbreaking. "He saved my life," she said, her voice steady despite the tears running down her cheeks. "And I wanted him to know that I never forgot." Sarah's story spread quickly after Elvis's death. Reporters tracked her down. They interviewed her mother. They found the hospital records that confirmed everything: the diagnosis, the treatment, the miraculous recovery. And slowly, the story of that night in Houston became one of the most treasured Elvis stories ever told. But what people didn't know until years later was that Sarah wasn't the only one. Elvis had done this dozens of times throughout his career, quietly, privately, without cameras or publicity. He paid medical bills for strangers he'd never met. He visited children in hospitals when no one was watching. He gave away cars, houses, and money to people who were struggling, often under the condition that they never tell anyone where the help had come from. Elvis understood suffering because he'd lived it, said Joe Esposito, Elvis's longtime friend and road manager, in an interview years after Elvis's death. He grew up poor in Tupelo, Mississippi. He knew what it was like to go hungry. He lost his twin brother at birth. He watched his mother work herself to exhaustion. He knew what it meant to hurt. And he spent his whole life trying to ease that hurt for other people. But Elvis saw something no one else noticed. In all the chaos of fame, in all the screaming and the lights and the spectacle, Elvis never lost sight of the individual. He could be performing for 20,000 people and still notice the one person who needed him most. That was his gift, not his voice, not his charisma, not his ability to move a crowd, but his ability to see people, really see them, to recognize suffering when everyone else was too distracted by the show. The scarf Elvis gave Sarah that night in 1973 was later donated to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in Cleveland, Ohio, where it remains on display to this day. Next to it is a photograph, slightly faded, of Elvis kneeling beside Sarah in the Houston Astrodome, his hand holding hers, his face full of tenderness and concern. Underneath the photograph is a bronze plaque that reads, March 8, 1973, the night Elvis stopped the show. What he did next became legend. Today, Sarah is in her 50s. She's a pediatric nurse at Texas Children's Hospital, the same hospital where she was once a patient fighting for her life. She's dedicated her entire career to caring for sick children, inspired by the compassion Elvis showed her that night. She works in the oncology ward, helping families navigate the darkest moments of their lives, offering comfort and hope when everything seems hopeless. Elvis taught me that fame and success mean nothing if you don't use them to help people, Sarah said in a recent interview, sitting in her small office surrounded by photos of children she's cared for over the years. He could have ignored my mother. He could have kept singing. He had 19,000 other people to think about. But he didn't. He stopped everything to make a dying little girl feel seen. That's the kind of person he was. And that's the kind of person I've tried to be. The story of Elvis and Sarah reminds us that the most powerful moments in life aren't the ones that happen on stage. They're the ones that happen in the quiet spaces between the applause. They're the moments when someone with everything stops to help someone with nothing. They're the moments when fame and power are set aside for something more important, human connection. Elvis could have been remembered only for his music, his movies, his legend. But he chose to be remembered for something more. He chose to be remembered for his heart. And in the end, that's what made him the king. But the story didn't end there. After Elvis's death, Sarah's mother found a letter in her mailbox. It was postmarked from Memphis, dated just 3 days before Elvis passed away. Inside was a handwritten note on Elvis's personal stationery, the words slightly shaky, as if written by someone who was tired or ill. Dear Sarah, I heard you're doing great. They tell me you're going to be a doctor someday. I'm so proud of you. Keep fighting, keep loving, and never forget that you're a miracle. You proved the doctors wrong, kiddo. You're stronger than all of us. Love, Elvis. That letter is now framed in Sarah's home, hanging on the wall next to a photograph of her and Elvis from that night in Houston. She reads it every morning before she goes to work, a reminder of the man who saved her life and changed her forever. Decades later, fans still talk about the night Elvis stopped his concert for a dying little girl. Bootleg recordings of that show are among the most sought-after Elvis recordings in existence, not because of the music quality, but because of what they captured. The silence, the raw emotion, the sound of 19,000 people witnessing something sacred. Collectors pay thousands of dollars for those tapes, not to hear Elvis sing, but to hear the moment humanity broke through the spectacle. Elvis showed us that real strength isn't about power or fame, said Reverend Jesse Jackson, who cited the story in a speech about compassion and civil rights. It's about being willing to stop everything to help one person in need. That's what leadership looks like. That's what love looks like. Today, there's a small memorial outside the site where the Houston Astrodome once stood. The building has since been replaced, but the memory remains. The memorial features a bronze statue of Elvis kneeling, his hand outstretched, and the inscription, "In memory of the night compassion stopped the show." Visitors leave flowers, scarves, teddy bears, and handwritten notes. And every year on March 8th, fans gather there to remember the night Elvis proved that the greatest performances aren't always the ones with the loudest applause. Sometimes, they're the ones that happen in whispers, in tears, and in the quiet moments when someone chooses love over everything else. Elvis stopped his show for Sarah. But really, Sarah's story showed the world who Elvis truly was. Not a performer, not a superstar, not the king of rock and roll, but a man who understood that behind every face in the crowd was a human being with a story, a struggle, and a heart that deserved to be seen. And that's why, nearly 50 years later, people still cry when they hear about that night in Houston. Because it reminds us that in a world that often feels cold and indifferent, there are still moments of pure, unfiltered compassion. Moments when someone stops everything just to say, "I see you, you matter, and I'm here." That was Elvis. That was always Elvis.